Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So we are here today through the generosity of the Alan Smith Endowed Visiting Professorship. And so I don't want to repeat everything that I said last week because we had our keynote address last week and I kind of gave a little bit of background about Alan Smith. But I do feel like for anyone who maybe wasn't here last week or who managed to forget between now and then, I just wanted to give a little background. So Alan Smith was a professor here at Simmons from about 1977 through his passing in 2008. And he taught in the School of Library and Information Science, mostly in the areas of reference, humanities, and oral history. I was actually lucky enough to take his reference class. I think there's probably some other alums of Alan's class, if not here in the room, then probably online. And he was just a really amazing teacher and a really amazing person, and just really a Renaissance man. So as I've been telling people as they've been coming in today, in addition to being a professor of library and information science, he was also a farrier. So he shoed horses in his spare time. And he wrote the definitive guide to the Appalachian dulcimer, which, I'm happy to let you take a look at this copy if you would like. But as I said, he was just a really amazing teacher. And I remember talking to him at one point as I was starting to get into my focus on information literacy and library instruction. And I wanted to do a paper or like an independent study using like some framework for instruction to look at how librarians are teaching, and I was all excited and I was explaining it to him and he was like, oh yeah, you can do that if you want. He's like, but what I found is students mostly remember what you say when you're on a tangent. So you should just try to make your class as much of a tangent as possible. But just keep that in mind, panelists. But at any rate, this year we were very happy to welcome Dr. John Budd, who is Professor Emeritus from the University of Missouri School of Library and Information Science. Dr. Budd has also had a very long and varied career with a lot of focus on various aspects of information and intersections of information and philosophy. And we're really excited to have him here with our panelists tonight to talk about myths and disinformation across the disciplines. So in addition to our visiting professor, Dr. John Budd, we also have Naresh Agarwal from Library and Information Science, Daren Graves from Education, Leanne Doherty from Political Science, Moura from Communications, and joining us online is Carolyn Rogers from Public Health. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Budd.
Okay, I get to moderate, and I'm really happy because that means I get to ask questions and I don't have to answer them. So let's dive right into this. And I want to get your feeling about whether or not there should be a distinction made between misinformation and disinformation. What do you think about that right off the bat?
Jeez.
Not all at once.
Well, I'll start. I mean, I may have this wrong, so you're going to start throwing, rotten vegetables at me from the audience. But the distinction that I make when I hear misinformation and disinformation to me has a level of intentionality. And I don't think misinformation doesn't have some intentionality to it, but disinformation seems like a really concerted effort to have information out there to very deliberately confuse, muddle the situation, which to me stands in a little contrast to misinformation, which I think might still have some measure of intentionality, but a little more benign is how, in terms of how I think about it. Maybe they might believe the information that they're putting out there, right? As opposed to disinformation feels like fabrication, right? Feels like something that you're trying to pull the wool over someone's eyes intentionally. So that's how I think.
The example I give for misinformation is around research around autism and vaccines, right? And how that first initial study was done. That was misinformation. It was published by a journal. You'd think it was in a journal that it was valid, and it was wrong information. It was just credited afterwards. Disinformation for me in disciplinarily is the big lie that Donald Trump somehow won the election and Joe Biden did not. That there's intentionality, there's polarization behind it. And I think it's an interesting I like how you framed that, there might be intentionality in both, but there's a polarization or an intentionality to disinformation to achieve some certain goal in from my perspective. I don't know.
Yeah, I think disinformation to me has a particular malice to it. Like it's malintended. It's meant to deceive. It is meant to discredit someone's reputation. It's where misinformation can be a little bit misguided or can maybe not be the whole truth, or people are holding back other important information. And in terms of reporting, I'm a journalist by trade, and I think, we deal with misinformation all the time where people will present facts to us, and when we are supposed to go and fact check, or somebody fact checks our story for us, that's where we can discover misinformation, right? But disinformation very much is presented as fact, knowing that it is not fact. That to me is the distinction.
So I did a paper on disinformation behavior framework, and have an entire section on the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And I think it's pretty much what you all said about intentionality being a big part of disinformation. But
Let me make
But I
a
was
note
thinking-
of that.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about your question. So this distinction is there, but your question was, what should it be there, right? Should there be a distinction? And I was thinking that before I wrote the paper, maybe 5 years before that, I didn't know this word disinformation at all. And if somebody said misinformation, I would know that, okay, false information or wrong information. But if somebody said disinformation, I was like, what's that? Right? So I think disinformation is more academic. And so now, since we have so much of false information going out there, and I think a lot of it is anything that is like honestly wrong, which is like misinformation, I think that should not be part of a general conversation, I think. So in general, we should call this information as misinformation. So ideally, now there's a distinction, but it should not be, I think, based on your question.
Okay, well, based on my question, I don't have.
Carolyn.
Oh,
Well, I was gonna say from a public health perspective, I think that disinformation and misinformation go hand in hand, because for me, disinformation would be the Tuskegee study.
Yes.
It was information purposely withheld. And they knew that. And so if we looked at and brought it current to today, then COVID-19 would be the most recent misinformation, because it was something new that happened and people didn't really know and understand it. And as they continued on with the process, information became revealed, and it wasn't done deliberately. But I think that when you deliberately withhold information, it leaves room for misinformation. But the disinformation was, like I said, that was the Tuskegee study, which was actually the United States public health study. And so to me, they're correlated because one controls the other. It's like there's an action to a reaction, and you have people that do things on purpose, even for political gain. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I'm going to mention something that I spoke about last Thursday, and a philosopher named Fred Dretske, some of you may be familiar with Fred Dretske, back in 1981 said that misinformation and false information are no more types of information than decoy ducks and rubber ducks are types of ducks. What do you think about that?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah.
I'm trying to process it.
Yeah, one more time. Yeah.
Okay, misinformation and false information are no more types of information than decoy ducks and rubber ducks are types of ducks.
When is the
So
fight?
information is a breed apart. Misinformation or disinformation, whichever you choose, is something else altogether.
So it should not be confused with information.
Yeah.
That's.
So it should be called lies?
Well,
So
I
do
don't
we
know.
need a
That's
new word?
Actually, that is something that we've talked about a lot in the industry. And I think to the point that was made earlier, where disinformation is a term that we use on the academic side in the industry and journalism, we have been hard, or I would say that there's been a big push to just call it lies or fake news, which then eventually got used to call real journalism as fake news. But I do think that it depends on who your audience is, right? If you're in a room of folks who are having these kind of complex, nuanced situations, then I think that it's okay to have these kind of like more nuanced conversations of should there be a distinction versus not. But I think that if we're in a class with students, we should call it lies. Call it lies.
No,
Call it what it is.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree, because, you do bring up a good point. Information is information. It's meaningful. Misinformation is not meaningful. Disinformation is not meaningful, but I think what we have to look at is the purpose behind why, because, you know, some people come in with an intention and that intention needs to be looked at. But you know, you bring up a good point because it's not information that's useful. Misinformation is not, it's not information. It's not validated. Disinformation, it's not validated. So it's all false information. And they both need to be fact checked, you know? So I think for me, that's the commonality between the two.
I might argue, though, some dis and misinformation is used for a purpose, right? So it may not be useful for us to maintain a democratic society, little d, but it is being used for campaigning. It's being used to kick out trans members of state houses in Montana. It's being used to not teach critical race theory when folks don't know what it is. So it's useful in a way that is malicious, maybe, and problematic. But that's where the information part of the word becomes problematic, right?
And I think this is it's a very difficult territory, because when we talk about information, right, then there is data, there is facts, there's opinion as well, right? And a lot of the times we might say that my opinion is information, whereas somebody else's opinion is not. Right?
Yes, it's happening all the time.
Yes. And that is problematic, because then who defines what information is correct versus not? And there are two sides of the divide who are trying to propagate a certain narrative, right? And there was an ACES member, Thomas Froelich, who told me that we should be wary of false equivalences. We should not say that both the sides are equal and both the sides have the narrative. So one side is clearly more wrong than the other side. But at the same time, it's different narratives and different points of view and different, like we believe in democracy and freedom of expression and ideas and information, right? And some people don't.
Right.
Right. And it's what agenda do people have in terms of, we also believe in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? But I have recently faced and seen a number of people who do not believe in it, who believe like in a big guarding and protection, being protective and being an exclusive group of people who do not want anybody outsider to come in, an insider outsider kind of a role. And there's a lot of that narrative. And I find that when that part of a segment is in a majority, then if you are a minority voice trying to speak for diversity, then that becomes very dangerous. Like you're stepping into dangerous territory when you're trying to argue with 500,000 people who believe in that.
What if I could just add to it, just to make this thing a little more complex, because I like this sort of metaphor, because I think we're operating, so when we talk about facts and things like that, right? Like that assumes that like we all agree that facts are these objective things, right? That everybody agrees is a thing, right? Which is not always true, right? And so I'm thinking about the decoy duck. The decoy duck, when we like take its pulse, is not a duck. To that animal, to someone who doesn't know that there's a decoy duck out there, it's a duck, and you move accordingly, right? And so it's a really fascinating. I know we're in this sort of post-fact era, which is like really scary to me as someone who's an educator, someone who operates under logic, and I do think we have to wrestle with the fact that from a philosophical perspective, like what is objective, like what is actually a thing that we can all grab our hands on and say, this is a thing. That's not all. I mean, for a lot of us, we operate in a world where we just like, if we assume that the duck is there, the duck is there. And so it's a duck. So what are you talking about? Right. But if the duck's not there to someone else for whatever reason, they can't see it, they want to believe it's a decoy duck, whatever, right? It's complicated.
And
right?
What you're talking about is an intellectualization of argument, right? So when folks ask me all the time, why do conspiracies exist? Conspiracy theories seem to exist more now than they did before. And a lot of times folks try to argue with intellect, right? To argue the facts, right? So say, no, the earth is round. We know that planes go around the earth, and here's why, and it's not. But what we're not getting to the heart of is why people believe this stuff. What has led them to this place that they believe that this is true? When I know it's a duck and you know it's a pipe and it's a pipe, and it's this very interesting space of trying to intellectualize arguments that can't be intellectualized because they're coming from a place where circumstances have made someone believe something for whatever that reason is. And I think that's why, as somebody who has studied public policy and American politics for 25 years now, it's very hard to go into a classroom and say why folks are making the decisions they are right now. Why folks, So when you talk about this minority, right, trying to fight, the minority voice really is the folks that are anti-CRT and anti-trans, but they're getting a voice in these spaces, and we don't really ask why, right? We just assume it's happening because the Republican Party has decided to have a culture war platform or something like that. But it's not just leadership that's doing it, it's folks in those other spaces.
And if I could just add, to sort of try and add a little to my point, I think some people feel like that other folks have there are facts, and if you don't agree on this fact, it's because you haven't thought about it.
That's correct.
Right? So I see a lot of things on social media, just think. And it's just like, I understand that impulse, right? I think it's very I think it's a very patronizing way of argument, right? Because there are people who don't see, who see the decoy duck as a real duck, who have thought it through and think it's a real duck, okay? And so just be like, no, it's like, just think. It's like, I did think, and I think this is a real duck, right? And so I guess Leanne's point around well, okay, how does one come to these conclusions? What are the motivations? What do you believe, right? And belief is information and faith are things that are really, that I know we don't often put together, logic and faith, but faith is a big piece of this.
Yeah, faith and narratives and.
Sorry, Carolyn was just about.
Jump out of your skin here.
No, I was just gonna say that I think that a lot of that, because I observe people, and people come to conclusions based on their own personal experiences, because just like Leanne mentioned, conspiracy theories come from something that they have seen. Now, they may have not seen it correctly, or they may have not heard it correctly, but they've seen something, just like we can take the Tuskegee syphilis study. You have a lot of people now that still do not trust the government because of their personal experiences or somebody in their family experiences. And so they are thinking that something may be malicious, even though it may not be. And again, a lot of that comes from their personal experiences, which then influences their perceptions, and perceptions are just how people view things based on their, morals and values. And so that's why I mentioned earlier that when I look at disinformation and misinformation, there's a correlation to it, because there is a purpose. Disinformation has a purpose. And, like we mentioned earlier, and like Leanne talked about, sometimes it is for political purpose, but it's not. And what I was trying to say is that it's not information that it's not good information. Okay. And, to go back to the example that was used with, a rubber duck and a decoy duck, or whatever the term that was used, is still not good information. It's still false information. The same with misinformation, it's still false information. So in that standpoint, it's not good for anybody, but it can be good for a purpose, whether it's a political, stance or whatever the case may be. So, but it came from something. There's a historical narrative that has created this perception in that individual's life, or even in a particular culture.
And to Carolyn's point, right? So you have this personal experience that you had growing up, and now you have some narrative that's going on, right? And you might know it's false, but it agrees with your point, with your experience. And now you don't care about whether it's correct or not. It agrees with your point of view, and then you support it wholeheartedly, and you even forward it and all that without really caring about whether it's actually true or not. And sometimes I feel people that that this information is going to directly harm a group of people, and still you pretend like innocence in that. You say that, no, this is fine, this is what it is correct. And I see that happening more and more, and people just do it.
We have to remember that there's a lot of anger that is affiliated with this. And anger is a powerful, visceral emotion. And when people are wronged in some kind of way, or perceive a wrong, whether it's legitimate or not, there can still be a genuine anger that can lead to conspiracy theories, overreaching, disinformation or misinformation, believing what you're told about this. And the worldview is another very, people aren't coming into this with blank slates.
That's right.
People are coming in with a set of beliefs. And whether you agree with those beliefs or not, they are strong, they are powerful, and they lead people to accentuate those beliefs and maybe avoid other voices. So why do people engage in mis or disinformation? Why do we do it? We in the
I wouldn't be
global
here if I
sense,
knew the
not-
answer.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
We'd be-
good job.
Yeah.
What is the thing? I mean, journalism,
Yeah,
do that.
yeah, tell me. I covered 2016, so I am constantly thinking about why do people engage and believe with, and I think, I think that we can't talk about this topic without also bringing in social media and also the constant feed of echo chambers, right? And you go deeper and deeper into it, and for folks who are already engaging with it and say that they believe this person or agree with this person, then let's say this person has another lofty conspiracy theory that they're going to talk about and put on their site, that person is more likely to engage with that because they already have trust in that one person who already agreed with them, right? So I think that a lot of it, to be honest with you, is people who are looking for community in some capacity or for some type of engagement with a person who also agrees with them, right? And I think that it's challenging.
Another C word, you said community, another one that comes to mind for me as someone who's trained as a psychologist is control. And I think that information can give people a sense of control, a sense of order where there is chaos, right? And so a lot of us engage in, like, we don't know what's going on, like we read the news, or we don't know how to do this, like we go find the instructions or whatever, right? And so once we have enough information, whether this is true or not, it gives us a sense of like things are now under our control, right? And so I think the misinformation, the disinformation I think people are looking for that sense of control and order more than they're looking for, like, I don't know, the actual truth, right? And so what happens is, to me, is that when people receive the information that then sort of confirms, like you said, that people are not coming as empty slates, right? When it confirms the views, the experiences that they have, you glom onto it because then you go, okay, like now this chaotic situation is not as chaotic as at least I understand what's the information, I understand what's going on. And when I have that, that gives me a sense of safety, a sense of security that I don't have when I don't have information, right? And I just want to be clear, like we all do this. This is not like people over on this side of the spectrum are like being brainwashed, and people over on this side of the political spectrum are rationalizing everything. That's one of our biggest problems. Like, there's a great psychology research about this that shows that people who we disagree with, we assume that they didn't think about it. And that we came to these and we went through this like rigorous process to come to our conclusion, right? And so that when we hear that in the language, brainwash, drinking the Kool-Aid, think, right?
Woke.
Right. And so I think we all like to glom onto information that gives us that sense of security and control.
Can I add another C word?
It makes sense to us. So we want to believe in that. It's not just believing in it, it's wanting to believe in it as well.
Can I add another C
Leanne.
word?
Go for it. Yeah. Capitalism.
Another C.
Yes, because you like this?
Yeah.
Private media requires clicks.
Oh, for sure.
Another C.
Right, another C.
Yeah.
So the idea of a private media that is not really giving information, we do not have a journalistic integrity media right now, I would argue, in all spaces.
In all spaces.
You're welcome. Caveat to my dear colleague. But what you see now with the right-wing and left-wing media in the United States, right, whether it's Fox or crooked media, whichever one you want to choose, propaganda not as a bad word, but they're perpetuating a narrative to make money. They're not doing that. I mean, yes, for the good of democracy, sure. We all think that. And both things can be true, and to buy their swag, and to get podcast commercials, and to do this. So the very nature of how we've constructed our economic system, when we have a disparity of wealth that is the biggest we've ever had in our country, then puts these information narrow, the rabbit holes that we go down.
That's right.
To be more and more. So it's about the blame of capital, like you took a job from me. You are taking over this. Any group that's an other, right, comes into this space. And it really has to do with, I mean, the Globe had an amazing article the other day as a parent of a teenager right now. I was glommed onto it. Students in the United States, in cultures that have great wealth disparity, are taught to be much more hardworking. That's the #1 priority. Then as opposed to countries like Japan, they use as an example, where the wealth disparity is less, right? So even the narratives we use in our information about hardworking and over to AP tests, whatever it may be, is based in this kind of capitalist narrative, which then our information, so then kids are saying, well, if I don't get this score on my SATs, I can't get into a college. Okay, well, that's actually not true, but it is true, Mom. They told me that was true. Who told you it was true?
Right.
Well, TikTok told me it was true. Instagram told me it was true. Reddit told me, the Discord I'm on, Vice News, whatever it is. And I think that helps, not saying there's not, of course, there's conspiracy theories in non-capitalist countries and things like that, but I just think it's a kind of perfect storm of wealth disparity and this market that has really allowed for this, because it sells. People click on it.
I would actually throw in a P word, and
Okay.
that's pride. You know, I've witnessed people who, once they find out that they're wrong, it's hard for people to admit it, because especially if they're on social media or have a following, because now if they admit that they're wrong, people, one, may not follow them anymore. They may lose their reputation and capitalism if they're getting paid for that information. But, you know, there's a lot of people out there who know that they're wrong. And they have found out that the information that they have been following or been dispersing to individuals has been false. And the question is, why won't they change it? I think pride is one of the biggest things, and people will not admit to it or apologize, because in American society, we feel that if we apologize, you know, for something, we don't want people to know that we are wrong, because our reputation is now going to be ruined.
I think also too, to bring in a little bit of the news organization, and to your point about pride and not wanting to admit when one is wrong, I also think that taking a look, up until very recently, teaching journalism media literacy was really hard to talk about fake news, because there was no like, and then what is the consequence of this thing? I think we often learn like, what is the consequence? So we tell a lie, what's the consequence? As a kid, you might have gotten a timeout, you might have got a scolding, you might have had a conversation with a parent or guardian or someone else who was important in your life. Up until very recently, I'm gonna say in the last 6 months, first with Alex Jones of InfoWars, and then most recently with Tucker Carlson, there was no consequence for the media organization, right? And even Alex Jones is declaring bankruptcy so he can avoid paying the families a trading hook, right? So I think that there's also a bit of until very recently, there has been no significant consequence for media corporations that literally will send text messages saying, I know this is a lie, but we're gonna tell it, top half of the story anyways, you know. So I think that's another thing too, is there hasn't been consequences.
So
Let me throw out another term that does begin with a C,
I love that.
cognitive dissonance,
Yes.
which does get to pride. Why are we not able to see the disjuncture in what is said and what we're holding as a belief, and simply dismiss it? Well, one of the reasons psychologically is it's hard. It's hard to let go of a belief, an idea. I hesitate to say it, but a held truth.
Yeah, and so one word that I was going to add was not a C word or a P word. So,
Okay.
That's it, you can't talk.
yes, so this is fear.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was
But it
not
is
going
an
to say.
F word.
Yeah. So that's why I didn't say the letter, but so it's fear, but so there's a lot of inequality in the world, right? And that is a given. And what happens is that a lot of these narratives feed on fear. And you'll find that a lot of the misinformation is about fear mongering, is about creating a fear of the other. And let's say there's a child, right, who's asking a parent for chocolate, right? And the parent says that, no, I don't want to get you a chocolate, and the child is crying. And suddenly the parent picks up the child and puts the child on top of a cupboard, right? And now the child is crying to put me down. And the child is no longer asking for the chocolate. So the parent has solved the problem without actually buying chocolate for the child. And the child is now crying to be put down. So this is what happens in this, this is a very weird example, but I'll tell you how it works. So if you are in the government, right, and you have to solve people's problems, you have to build roads, you have to build infrastructure, you have to provide hospitals, you have to get people jobs, and you have to provide employment, you have to solve all the biggest problems, right? And it's very, very hard, right? And so no government can solve it very effectively. And no matter what you do, you'll always displease a group of people. Now, the easy thing that you can do is that you just create a narrative, a fear of the other, saying that those people are stealing your jobs, right? And I'll protect you from those people, right? So the moment you do that, you're deflecting the problems from really solving real problems into saying that, creating the fear of the other and saying that you people fight those others and I'll save you from it. And that is it. So now I don't need to build hospitals. Now I don't need to build roads. I don't need to give you jobs. And I'll believe in you. I'll vote for you no matter what.
But Naresh,
Right.
that's not new, right?
That's not new.
So what's new now that makes this more?
Oh, it's the social media and algorithms.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right, okay.
That is what has led to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would add that in addition to there's this sorting going on both on social media, which creates the echo chambers. And I think we also have, you probably know this better than I do, this sort of, what do they call it? The big sort, right? Where people are moving to places, people are less likely to be working and living in places with folks who have different views than them,
More
right?
than
And-
6 folks have said they will move out of Florida in the next 12 months.
Right, and
Based
so,
on their children's,
right, and so I think that's exacerbating it too, and that leads, we've all said this, like, how do these people, whatever, believe this or do that, right? And we're like, what the hell is wrong with them? And it's because we've eroded, I don't know, the spaces where people used to work and live across different factories, the military, other unions, right? These places have eroded that don't allow us to be like, okay, so like me and this other person just disagree on politics, but he's still, that person's still a human being who like cares about his family, right? And so I think the more we move ourselves online and physically into places where nobody is pushing back against us, which I think is a really unhealthy way to live in general, especially as an educator. That's how I feel. Yeah, then we're right for all the things that we're talking about, right? There's no one's gonna push back against, and no one's gonna say like, wait, like maybe you can think about this a little different and then push you into that state of cognitive dissonance, right? No one wants to feel that cognitive dissonance. And so the algorithm is organized to make that happen. And then people are moving to spaces so they don't have to feel the distance.
Robert Putnam wrote about this in the 1950s in a book called Bowling Alone, right? So folks didn't go to bowling alleys anymore. They lost these, these kind of traditional, you're describing that. So from, he blamed TV in the text, that television was going to be the demise of this kind of civil discourse and society. So what you just described, you're like Putnamite right now, right? Like, yeah, so that's where the cross-discipline comes into place. But these ideas of doing alone, what are you doing alone, right? Where are we lacking critical thinking dissonance too, right?
Yeah.
Not just arbitrarily.
Another seed.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Some of that also has to do with generational stuff. We don't have enough intergenerational spaces in the United States right now, which then is another beautiful way for folks to sort of understand how they're experiencing the same spaces and the same information differently. So and there's so much. The Pew does this amazing research that just shows that like when you have like one meaningful meaningful interaction with a person that you might hold some like terrible prejudice against, and that changes everything. Just one. And we need more.
StoryCorps actually does a really interesting podcast where they partner people up from different parts of the country who have opposing views. They force them to have a conversation. And then at the end, they talk about like, oh, wow, like I didn't realize that someone who voted for so-and-so could also, like, I didn't recognize that, like, you were doing that because you care deeply about your family and you think that this is the best decision, and I think that that's a really important, those kinds of things are needed more.
But I found something interesting. So let's say you have somebody with an opposing point of view, and on a one-on-one conversation, you have a very meaningful interaction, and the person also agrees that you were right or something. But then the person goes back to a public forum and then repeats the lies, because now it's more fruitful to the agenda to repeat the lies than agreeing with you, person, like in a one-on-one conversation.
So one of the reasons there is mis or disinformation is people do want to fit in.
Sure.
So you find a home for yourself, as it were.
Talking to first year students at Simmons, I teach intro to American politics this semester. They are afraid to check on boxes, like to click a like or like an Instagram post in order, because they are afraid to be canceled. If that is where you're coming from, this one little arbitrary, and I'm Gen Xing myself here right now by saying we're probably not, but that there is this narrative out there that they are incredibly concerned. 18, 19-year-old students are incredibly concerned about someone tracing their social media, and if they liked something or not, could be their identity. I think it's not necessarily popularity, it's where do I fit in this space of discourse that's not really discourse. Right? It's not, it's a kind
Collective monologue.
of, ooh.
Yeah, it's a term used in psychology when you have like two toddlers. You look at them from afar, it looks like they're having a conversation, and then when you come together, you listen to what's happening, they're really not even talking.
And I think about Carolyn all the time with public health, like,
Yeah.
how are there any just beliefs in health? I don't know, I get frustrated with this one, but.
Well, for me, in public health, it's put me in a unique space because, especially when it comes to research, I do a lot of observation and just listening. And that's how I find out that everybody has these different perspectives that again came from their own personal experiences. And their personal experiences, again, one of the things that always exists there, and I'm glad you brought up the F word, which is fear. Fear and pride go hand in hand because people are afraid to stand alone. They're afraid to stand alone. And that goes back to what you said, Leanne, about the students, checking a box because there's somebody hiding behind this computer without a face that's going to put them in what we now have as cancel culture. A lot of people are afraid of that. And so they're willing to go along for fitting in because the majority of people just want to live a peaceful life. And when something disrupts their peaceful life, this is where the issues come from. Most people want privacy, but we're in this new generation now where there's social media and there really is no privacy. I mean, some people have these Alexa boxes and, Siri, that you can get information from that's recording you and things of that nature. And so it really does couple fear, insecurity, and all of those things because people's livelihoods can be changed in a second based on how many followers a person has. And that's where the political field comes into play without having a group and a backing, because if you say the wrong thing and you don't have a group or a following, you may not have people, you may not have a strong enough or powerful enough group that can keep you relevant or that can keep you with a job. So now we have to bring in all of those things and think about for people when they're sharing information, even if they know the information is not accurate.
Yeah, and you talked about fitting in, right? And Brenda Derwin used to talk about the human struggle being to fall in line and to fall out of line. And so there are times we want to fit in, there are times we want to stand out, right? And a lot of the times, false narratives are about fitting in the sense that there is an exclusivist agenda over there, and you want to fit in as part of that, because on the other agenda, you might be a minority from the minority population. But now, as somebody who is propagating racism or hate, right, then you become part of a bigger narrative and you feel powerful. So there is power over the power control, but there is also this part of fitting into this larger narrative, which gives you a sense of power.
Yeah, that is very true. Let me throw out something else for your deliberation here. Several decades ago, George Orwell said, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Where are we right now?
In that time.
Are we in a time of deceit? That's the question.
I think we are. I think we are.
Revolutionary act.
Yeah, I think we are in that time because, all of the things that we're talking about, again, there's a fear for people to stand up for what is right, for what is true. And again, that could be a debate based on what a person considers as factual information. But, you know, with these groups that we have out here, I think that they're, you know, we talk about bullying in the elementary schools and things of that nature, but bullying exists in society now in general, where if a person dares to tell the truth, they might be without a job because they're saying something that is not popular, you know. And if you say something that is not popular and you have enough people that have accepted the other side, you may not be able to fit into this society anymore. You may be ousted. You know, there's a lot of people out there that may be in the homeless crowd because of some of the things that they've said that could be right, but the majority of society is not going to accept it. And I think we are absolutely there right now.
I would say I think we're, to describe this, so I think we're in a time where information might be the most important form of capital, right? Maybe there was a time where there was gold was the capital, or I think information is like, we're in like the information economy, right? And so to the extent that information, to getting back to Leanne's capitalism point, to the extent that information is something that is transactional, that we're using to like get something else, like you know, of material gain, right? In a lot of ways, then we bend, like the way we bent gold and, you know, shaped gold to be what we need it to be. Like we're gonna do that with information, right? To make it what we need it to be so we can profit off of it. And so in that regard, like, yeah, we can totally be in a deceit era, because we're in an era where like we need the information to bend in our way so that we can profit from it. And that is not gonna, you know, living in the world of just like, again, we do a whole philosophy thing on what is objectivity, what is a fact. I'm not gonna go there, but the notion, if we can just agree that there are things that are like we can all agree on, that may not profit us, you know, individually or collectively, right? It may not fit into the mold that we can then benefit from it. And so in that regard, like the truth sometimes may not be like, you know, something that is of value to some groups of people. And therefore, like, yeah, then therefore we can start bending truths and information in ways that will, and that can be looked at as deceit for sure. Yeah.
Might I try to be positive for a second?
No. Stop.
I have this
Who are
reputation
you?
of being a cynical Pollyanna. If anybody knows the Pollyanna character from the 1940s and 50s, she was always looking on the bright side. So it's weird for a political scientist to be there, but I might take, or Leanne Doherty, one and the other. I might think this might be the beginning of the reckoning of deceit. And what I mean by that is if you, and again, if you look at general context, we have a very dramatic Supreme Court case decision that happened last year that took away the reproductive rights of many people in this country. Not the narrative of dogmatic of pro-life, pro-choice, but took away a right, which the Supreme Court had always been historically progressive in its decision-making. So this was a retroactive decision-making process, not based on precedent. What you have seen as a result of that, for example, are elections that have been based solely on that issue that have really spoken to the will of the majority, when 65% of folks say that there should be some type of abortion legally in this country. So you have a case of medical abortions being undermined by one judge in one county in Texas, where folks politically use that. But you see a Supreme Court that may have made a mistake with the ruling over the summer, then putting a stay on something. So this idea, the Dominion case, Tucker Carlson maybe losing his job because he was a sexual predator, and he still lost his job as the person that brings in the most money for this media source, Alex Jones and the like. You're seeing local elections come out a different way. Now, it's not fast enough for folks in 2023. Because these reckonings used to take a really long time on the pendulum, right? And not to be too historical. But I do think there has been a bit of a shift in what folks are. Now, are there going to be the folks that still put their kid on the cupboard? I really gotta talk to you about that. Talk about where that came from your soul.
No, I read that somewhere.
Okay, good. Okay. I really wanted to talk to you about that. I haven't tried that somewhere. It's not positive, but you also have more people participating in the formal and informal political process than you ever have before in the United States as well. And that causes tension too. That goes back to the fear because power is finite, right? And the folks that have been holding on for power for a really long time are losing power. And that's scary, that's fear. So we always think of the fear of like someone not getting something. There's also fear of losing something too. And I think that's where the reckoning piece is, because you're hearing a lot more folks publicly tell the truth. And those that don't tell the truth, like if you listen to Donald Trump these days on his stump speeches, no matter what you think of Republican, he's living in his own narrative of lies. And they're not getting the big claps like they used to anymore. Not for nothing, because his people lost a lot of elections in 2022. This is not over by any stretch. We will not see just, I do feel as though there is this little sunshine coming in, not necessarily about equality or anything, or DEI or anything like that, but just about folks getting back to, can we just not lie
Right.
anymore? We just went through a pandemic where, to Carolyn's point, we didn't know what we were doing. I never taught the pandemic chapter in public policy because I never thought it would happen. I thought we'd explode. We didn't explode, but we came really, really close to shutting it all down. So
I do think, to your point about there being a shift and a reckoning, I think that we are seeing that, at least on the journalism side, right? I think that what's happening now is just speeding up the death of an obituary for 24-hour cable news. I just think that people are not same. And I have no interest in whether or not you watch CNN, MSNBC, Fox, Cable, don't care. Just 24-hour news cycle, I think, is going away, because I think that what journalism is leaning into, and Daren, you and I can talk about objectivity, because I also have lots of issues with the word, and also, to be honest, with this word of truth, because I think that journalism, what the goal is, and what I hope to instill in my students, is this concept of make it make sense. Like, people are having these conversations in their own silos. Have your article be the table at which these conversations can happen, and help it make sense. And every story one story is not going to be the whole truth, but it's a slice of the truth, right? So continue reporting on that same topic, and like hopefully telling more slices of the story so we get closer to the truth. And I think that we're starting to see this shift in journalism back to sort of, to be honest with you, perhaps closer to whatever the roots were, right? Maybe a little bit closer to Watergate, right? Like era journalism, because that's what we're seeing, right? In terms of like modern day journalism, that's really what was the pinnacle moment and root of journalism was Watergate. And I think that we're starting to see that because there was a huge explosion of nonprofit news organizations. Huge explosion. If you haven't taken a look at the American Journalism Project, or there's a consortium of, I think it's called Independent News Network. There's one in Brookline that just started. Newton has one. Beverly has one. Maine has one. New Bedford has one. There's just, I think that they're starting to pull back. People are starting to pull back from that want of like, must know everything all the time to make it make sense. And I think that's where the reckoning is happening, is like, help us make sense of what's going on. So I hope.
So I'm glad you brought in this point, because this is one thing that I thought I must talk about when I came for this panel. And I told you that I wrote that paper on disinformation framework, and that was all about how disinformation comes about with all the narratives and echo chambers and filter bubbles and people's cognitive biases and all of that, and how we can fight false information using information literacy and then critical thinking and all the library and information science literatures about how libraries can help fight false information. And so there were a number of those mechanisms, but what I found was that recently I saw a number of cases in which people had succeeded in puncturing the filter bubble and helping fight false information, but that is very dangerous for them. And that's when your point came in, is that in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, right? And I saw another cartoon from 1962 which said that he was not being charged for speaking lies, he was charged for speaking facts. Right? So that is where so there was a story from Bangladesh recently where a journalist was charged for saying that the country is not doing well economically, and there's not enough food to put in people's plates, when the government was trying to say that the country is shining and there's a lot of economic development. So the journalist was detained was saying that my life hasn't changed.
For speaking truth
For
to
speaking
power.
truth to power, right? So speaking truth to power is still a very dangerous thing. And if you stand up for it, right, then people do stand up for it. And there are instances that they stand up, but then people are risking their lives and careers and a whole lot to do that right now in different societies across the world.
Where does freedom of information and the First Amendment fit into all of this discussion? I hate to bring
You
out
have
the
12
cynicism.
This is when I lose my positivity.
We have 9 minutes. Why don't you go first, Erin?
I mean, I'm a big, can you repeat your question? Because I'm trying to decipher from my like public records mindset and laws and where we should be in terms of that. So I'm sorry, can you repeat your question? Where does?
Oh, there was just, where does freedom of information as an idea and an ideal? And if we want to get to that, the First Amendment, where do these things fit into the discussion of the demise of 24-hour news, the Pollyanna vision for the future of society, or cynicism?
I will say, I mean, I think it's important to know too, that the First Amendment does not protect disinformation and fake news. It protects freedom of the press and it protects satire as well, right? So I think that that's an important distinction here. And I don't think that, you know, when you mentioned that, I began to laugh because we had a conversation. I'm teaching a social media journalism class in the era of what is happening to Twitter. So that was great planning on my end. But this concept of, you know, it's a push and pull, right? Of like, where can we exercise freedom of speech is really, really important. And, you know, it's social media organizations don't have to, they can ban you. They can, like, it is, you are on their network. They can ban you.
Louder for the people in the back.
Like they can ban, right? And actually This American Life just had a really interesting conversation with the person who did moderate the conversations on Twitter and gave some insight into the, at what point did they start really questioning Trump's tweets and like banning or putting information underneath? And I think that like, that is absolutely where your exercise of freedom of speech ends, is where it becomes dangerous.
Thank you. So there's two things on that. One, the freedom of, and this, I think too many Americans don't understand. The freedom of speech, the freedom of expression is not like some endless lines. Like there's limits to it. It's just simple. It's just simple. Like you can't yell fire in a crowded, right?
Yeah.
You can't threaten people, right? There's just limits, like period. So that's that. So, and then I'm thinking about like Mark Zuckerberg. He was like, oh, what can I do about that? Like, I don't know, it's your company.
That's right.
It's like,
That's
you
right.
get to like, it's
That's
not,
right.
you, Facebook and Twitter is not like, I'm sorry, it's not like a
That's meant
public,
to you.
it's not like a public right.
It's not the
it's an
Boston
app.
Common.
It's
Yeah.
it's an
Not
app that
bringing our
collects
cows.
information about you, right? And so, yes, like if you are the head of Twitter or Facebook or whoever, like you can make decisions about what the lines are and let the market figure out like how that works out. If the market doesn't like, you know, like the way you're doing it, then you might have to change it. Otherwise, like do what you gotta do.
Yeah, you may have missed this, but Robert Kennedy announced his run for the presidency as the Democratic candidate.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
And he's best known in the eyes of the American public as a Kennedy. So that's gets you about 80% of all your votes. For the rest of us, we know him as one of the 18 people that perpetuated 90% of false information about COVID vaccines on social media. 90% of all that information could be traced to 18 individuals. So to echo Daren's point, lack of regulation, which is a government intervention, this is battling against capitalism and the right, not of a freedom of speech, but a freedom of enterprise. And until we regulate enterprise to be a common good, Zuckerberg can stand up there, you know, your boy Elon Musk can stand up there and you know, kind of figure out what your boy. Anytime I don't want to associate with anybody, he's your boy. What I'm trying to get at though is that this is the connection between these multiple purposes that everyone is responsible for. If we are truly to have, like we were joking about Boston Common, bringing your cows all over on Boston Common, you know, City on the Hill and the like, that truly means everyone has to follow the same rules. And what Musk talks about as Twitter being a common space for dialogue, folks do not follow the same rules. And that's what regulation is actually helpful for. Regulation doesn't have to be a negative thing. Regulation could be a protectorate. Regulation could save children that are being trafficked. So, we've just become so, well, if we're gonna regulate that, then I can't talk. This is the cognitive dissonance that we suffer from as a society right now. And that's not intellectualism. That's just folks having conversations about what the world looks like.
Carolyn, anything you want to weigh in?
Well, I mean, this is all interesting to hear this because, my thought process was always these are private companies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Companies, just like private institutions, can regulate how they want to regulate. And I think that is the misconcept that has not been understood, is that there is a difference between a public space and a private space. And when you're in a private space, you can be regulated according to that private company. And public space is where we can then talk about this whole freedom of speech and things of that nature. So a person can go stand on the corner and say whatever they want to say. They're on the corner in a public space. But, when you come into this private entity, then you can be regulated. And I think that's where people do not fully understand what their rights are, so to speak.
Yep.
And that's where we need to be clear where information can be shared and where information can be limited, depending on what you call information.
And
So-
another thing that's happening is that a lot of people are misusing the institutions of democracy and freedom of speech and all that to spread false information. So they'll come and talk about lack of freedom of speech and by propagating hate speech, right? And or they will come and talk about like people forget that Hitler came to power through democratic means. Right?
Yeah.
So those are things like, so the institutions of power, the institutions of democracy and freedom of speech and information, right? Those need to be protected because those are being misused now.
Yes.
And I feel like the United States has, I don't know, Europe, like for example, Europe has like a really different sort of
Oh, yeah.
relationship to like information and misinformation. And I think some of that frankly probably stems from some of the real life implications, to your point, Naresh, about like how, hate speech was just allowed to be run rampant because, it's an ideal or whatever. And then you see what then you have a whole continent in ruins as a result. And so I think, let us not have to get to that point.
Right.
For us to figure out that like there are reasonable, there's legal and there's reasonable civil limits to like using words. Like I can talk about my mama in ways that you cannot. And that's just a fact. You know what I mean? That's just a fact. It's like, oh, we should all be able to talk about Daren. Like,
No. There's lots of lovely. Yeah.
you might, and then it's gonna, but like, no, right? And so there's just this notion that information is just free flowing. Everyone should be able to just say whatever the hell they want, whenever they want. It's just like, I don't know, a multiverse that actually realistically exists in. It doesn't work that way.
Well, it exists for some folks. That's right, because they're not punished.
But
Right, so they,
news
news organizations or the elite, whatever we're talking about, the super elite society,
If Rupert
right?
Murdoch said something about my mama, he would get punished. It would just not be it would be in a
We're not
very
in a court of
specific
law.
way.
Well,
Right.
but I appreciate that, and I'm glad you're gonna go after Rupert Murdoch after I talk today. But there are still stratas, this is the class distinction, right? There's still stratas of where information can be misused without repercussions. And I'm not a journalist, I'm not a library scientist, but I do know laws around libel and slander and the like. Folks still have difficulty navigating those spaces as well, when you've got local officials in my town talking about slander and libel. I'm like, oh boy, no.
you just throw this around.
Can't do it. It's something that somebody posted on Facebook, right? So I do think, to your point, everyone has become an expert on everything and an expert on nothing at the same time. And I think that as a result of that, we need institutions that we used to rely on. Let's say libraries. Let's say institutions, courts, the like, public health, right? There are folks, and I'm the worst, to Daren, to your point, if I was to conclude on this thought, I'm the worst offender, right? When I have a medical condition, I go to WebMD and I diagnose myself. as a daughter of a nurse, right? Like you know,
Doherty.com.
right. .com, right? .org.com, yeah.
What that com.
Yeah. With that being said, I don't even take my own medicine, right? To keep this analogy going. And it's hard to break out of that cycle. So if the demise of 24-hour news came so that the folks that are over a certain age that are part of my world would just shut it off, whether it's Fox or MSNBC in the background, I really think they'd be less stressed about it. And I think that would be really helpful for disinformation, because what they're not hearing is not journalism. They're not
That's
hearing
right. That's
journalism.
right. Yeah.
They're hearing
Fair enough.
someone perpetuate the narratives that they want to hear.
Breaking news.
And
Always.
Always.
Well, we're almost out of time.
I'll add one thing.
One
That,
thing.
yeah, so when you say freedom of information, I think that should be there, but not freedom of disinformation.
Well, that was my question. I guess that was a part of it.
Yeah.
But we don't have time to answer that. But let me exercise the moderator's prerogative and also exercise some shameless self-promotion.
Sure.
My most recent book,
Love it. Let's go.
which the Simmons Library has.
Okay, all right.
Is entitled The Library as Forum in the Social Media Age. And it attacks some of these questions head on.
Yeah.
There's another recent book that I want to commend to everyone, especially out there in TV land. A familiar name to some of you, Richard Haas, has written a new book entitled The Bill of Obligations. It is a companion to the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
The first obligation, be informed. And I don't think we have time for anything else because I believe it's
It is, we are.
the hour.
Thank you.
which
You're an amazing moderator. That was
Yeah.
fantastic.
Thank you for being an amazing set of responses.
Yay, and everybody.
Thank you. And thank you to the great audience. You laughed when you should have. You cried.
No, thank you. This was fantastic.
What was our total online too?
We had 30 people online.
That's a big event.
So now you're all famous.
Oh.
Well, Leanne was already.
No,
famous.
no, yeah. You may have seen my work going nowhere. You may know
That .com.
I'm just .org.com.
Thank you for having me by way of Zoom.
Bye, Karen.
Stay on. We'll get a picture maybe. Catherine, could you get a picture?
Yeah, can you be in the picture?
Yeah, can you be there?
Okay.
I'm like so fearful.
Should we sit here? or
Yeah, we know.
sit here? Am I in the way?
Are we-
No, you're fine.
Newfangled.
All right, everyone's. I took 3.
Yay.
Great.
It never happened unless there's a picture to post on social media.
Let's make it like Jen, so it sounds a little bit more legit.
Okay. That was a great question.
Yeah,
Wow.
It's not your first rodeo.
Thank you.
Pretty easy questions to answer.
Oh, I know, right, aren't
Questions
they?
to
I
answer.
love the question.
It was really, when you went into freedom of information, it was like, oh, man, are we talking public records and like how people hold on to information and don't give it to you?
Oh, that's
We're having a
amazing.
freedom of information battle in my little town over a school committee legislation.
I have you, but I'm surprised nobody mentioned, Reagan's lifting of that rule, the reason why we had Rush Limbaugh, because I mean, I think
The
that a
fairness
lot.
act.
Yeah, I mean, that was because you're talking about regulations.
Yeah.
and We used to
Yeah.
have rules.
Yeah.
About, you know.
1987, was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pivotal in
I-
terms of where we are today.
Yeah, and I definitely think you saw Fox News come in probably 2 years. I think
It
it
took
was
2
right
years after
yeah.
the grant, yeah.
But I think that what was difficult about the fairness doctrine too, is that it only pertained to those that were on the airwaves. It didn't pertain to, for example, newspapers, right? And I think that that's kind of where a lot of the criticism came from the fairness doctrine, but I agree, like, I think it's, and then also too, there are some stories that